Oh hey, it's Wes, and today it's time to talk about the new TTartisan 50mm 1.2 for Sony E-mount, APS-C. So let's get into it. When last we checked out TTartisan lenses, we were looking at the 35 1.4, a very small lens, very cute, but very surprisingly sharp lens. Very solid image quality for something so small and cheap. So, do 7 artisans keep up that trend with their new 1.2 50mm? Let's find out, starting with the categories, starting with build quality. Number 1, what we have here is again an all-metal construction. Pretty typical stuff for third-party, cheap, aftermarket lenses like this one. We're coming to expect it. We have the screw-on lens cap and no lens hood, so that's a little bit disappointing. Love to see a fun little metal lens hood, like on the Per Gear 51.8, has this very beautiful, almost Leica-inspired lens hood with the wind vanes. Oh yeah, that's nice. A lot heavier than the Per Gear 51.8 though. As you can see, there's a lot more glass here. Oh, she is wide open. Not much here but metal and glass. So you don't have an O-ring on the back, you don't have weather sealing. So overall, I can't give this more than an 8 out of 10. Solid as a brick, but it'd be nice to throw an O-ring in there or two. But boy, does she feel great. Speaking of feeling great, let's go on to handling. So this is small and reasonably light for a 1.2 lens, even though it's on APS-C. Although you do know there is heft to it, it's only heavy in relation to the tiny size of this lens. The aperture ring on the front here is very small. It has 2 little thumb grabs on it. And generally speaking, I don't like having the aperture ring in the front of the lens, but this one is so small that you rarely hit it by accident with your hand, but if your camera is dangling beside you, this is constantly going to be knocked about. It is a clicked aperture ring. As far as I know, there is no way to declick it. It sounds great, feels great, not quite as great as the one on the 35 though. This is still the winner for the most satisfying aperture click I have ever felt. Still good though on this. A little less resistance, a little bit smoother. The focus ring is probably the biggest issue I have with the handling of this lens. For a lens that has a reasonably long barrel, it's this tiny little strip around the middle. And so sometimes it's hard to get a hold of the focus ring, because this and this and this, all very, very smooth. And the knurling on this is actually very smooth as well. Whereas like on this lens, on the Per Gear, and a lot of other manual focus lenses, the knurling it has a nice coarse texture to it, so it grips your hand very nicely. This one is very smooth, it's easy to slide your fingers along, so it feels great in the hand, but isn't the best for general focusing performance, because it's easy to slip and hard to get a hold of. So overall, this is a solidly construction lens, but I've got some nitpicks on it, so I'm going to give that a 9 out of 10 for handling. It's great, but could be just a tiny bit better. Image quality. Once again, just like the 35, this is exceedingly sharp, surprisingly sharp, but not quite as sharp as my copy of the 35. It is still, for the money, which we'll talk about later, very, very good. Now, chromatic aberration, not very good. Chroma control, not that great. But that's not what we're expecting from this. We're expecting a lens that is fun to use and creates interesting images. But we'll talk about image character a little bit later. But just so you know, it's what you expect. When you open this up and point it into the sun, it's going to wash out pretty easily. However, it's not perfectly sharp at 1.2, especially around the edges. But once you go down to like 2.8, 5.6, honestly, you are not going to be able to tell the difference between this lens and a very expensive first-party lens. This is exceptionally sharp, especially if you're in the studio. There's not a lot of light washing around the scene. Not a lot of opportunity for chromatic aberration. This looks phenomenally sharp. So that is very satisfying, very pleasing. But the worst part about this lens is there is an enormous amount of distortion. Just off the handle distortion on this lens. That is unfortunate. And it's a little bit hard to correct because every lens's distortion pattern is a little bit different. You can apply a generic profile to it, but it doesn't quite get it just right. And you're probably not going to get a specific lens profile for this in Capture One or Lightroom. So that's a bit of a problem. So although you can get tremendous image quality out of this, unsurprisingly, it is not by any means perfect. I'm going to give that a 7 out of 10 for image quality. Image character. That's where you expect a lens like this to show up. And oh boy, it does. It doesn't quite have a vintage look, which is surprising. Let's get a vintage lens out here. We've got a Minolta 50. 1.7, I think. Yeah. Has a very vintage character, very lovely. But this is a lens of apparently modern optical design, or at least using modern optical techniques. So the background's generally very creamy, not very swirly. They can get a little bit nervous because, as you can see, if we look inside this lens, the aperture blades, I don't know what they were thinking here. They're curved, but not effectively. They show up in a very weird way. And so once you stop it down just a little bit, the bokeh gets a bit weird, a bit hexagonal. But that does lead to interesting lens flares, interesting effects. Overall, I do love the look of this lens. It's a lot smoother than I would have expected, especially at 1.2. Yeah, it's a 1.2, tends to blur backgrounds, but this is just an APS-C lens. So that's giving us an equivalent of 75 1.8, which isn't anything revolutionary with regards to smoothness or out of focus areas. Unfortunately, I didn't find a lot of what you might call 3D pop with this lens. It looks good, but not that great. Just kind of smoothly transitions out of focus. Doesn't really pop off the screen. Overall, I'm going to give that an 8 out of 10 for lens character. Autofocus, one of the most controversial categories I have for manual focus lenses. I'm going to give this a 0, which, interestingly enough, is a better score than I gave the 35 1.4. Why is that? Well, the 35 1.4, if you haven't seen my review already, it came to me completely decalibrated, which is weird because the screws in this were in very tight, and I don't know how this happened. I don't think it could have shipped that far in shipping. This one wouldn't focus past like 20 feet, maybe 30 feet. But I did eventually find, someone in the comments mentioned, if you loosen the screws on the focus ring, you can recalibrate it. And so now this one will focus to infinity. I will still dock points for autofocus if a lens, when it arrives, does not focus properly, because that's a quality control thing. If you can't get it right, you can't get it right. This one, however, does do its focusing just how you expect, but it also does have the screws that will allow you to recalibrate it if necessary. So overall, yes, that is a 0 for autofocus, but it's manual focus lens. It picks up in other categories such as value and lens character. So speaking of value, how does this compare? This thing is $100. That is shocking to me because there is a lot of metal and glass here, and generally well-designed metal and glass. So how does that compare to the field? Well, if we start at the bottom, we've got a Vivitar f2 50mm lens for $65. 7Artisans, very similar company, 51.8 for $90. We've got this little per gear right here for $80, 51.8. And 7Artisans, there's tons of lenses in this field that you can go to a 55 1.4 for $120, a 51.1 for $370. And then you can get an autofocus lens like the Yongnuo 51.8 for $120. I've heard the image quality on that is pretty mediocre though. So really anything with this aperture, with this image quality, is going to cost you more. And of course Sony has lenses, the 55 and the 50, Zeiss at $1,000 and $1,500 respectively. So needless to say, for this aperture, for this image quality, you honestly can't do better. So this is a very obvious 10 out of 10 for value. I really have no option to give this anything else. So that's phenomenal. Overall, that gives us a 42 out of 60. Not the highest score ever. Might be one of the highest scores of a manual focus lens though. Don't remember what score I gave the 7Artisans 35 1.4, which I really, really liked. But this, a more expensive lens, full frame, doesn't have even remotely the image quality of this. This is all about character. So overall, really enjoyed this lens. In some ways, these new third-party manual focus lenses are a little bit disappointing. In some ways, they are appointing. Why is that? Well, it's because, optically speaking, they're no longer like vintage throwback lenses that give you these very interesting characters. Well, like this 35 1.4. You put that on your camera, you're just having fun. You're creating really magical things. You're not taking it that seriously. You just want to make art and interest. Whereas these lenses, they're well made. They have good image quality overall. They look like modern lenses for the most part. So if you're looking to have some fun, you're still going to be taking pretty good quality pictures. They're not as interesting or exciting, but it depends on what you're looking for. Anyway, let me know down in the comments below what you're looking for. Is it more important that these manual focus lenses be fun and interesting, or that they actually have decent image quality and are kind of a little bit dry, honestly? If you have any questions or comments about this, let me know below. Again, there are image samples down in the description below, as well as purchase links so you can use my affiliate links to help support this channel and feed my fat cats. Which, apparently she doesn't want to be involved in this video today. So, until next time, let's go take some photos.